A very good morning to everyone. Welcome to MParks Ubin Day 2020 webinar. We are delighted to have all of you here with us today. My name is Kaming, and I'm from the Pulau Ubin team at the National Parks Board. Pesta Ubin is our annual celebration of the different facets of Ubin, such as the natural and cultural heritage, during which there will be many activities happening in Ubin. Through these activities, we hope that everyone will be able to learn something about this beautiful island of ours. As for Ubin Day, it is the last hoorah and the culmination of our long celebration. This year, as we can't gather due to COVID-19, the organizing committee has decided to bring the celebration to you with our first ever virtual Pesta Ubin and Ubin Day. Today is Ubin Day, and we have a very interesting lineup of talks for you. Here is an overview of today's talks. If you haven't signed up for these talks, fret not. You may still join us with the meeting links we share on the Zoom chat, or you may watch them live on our YouTube channel, MParks SG. We will kickstart our series of talks with a fascinating presentation that explores the heritage of Pulau Ubin through its architecture. We will time travel back now with Dr. Imran and Ms. Lee Ka Hui as they share with us the settlement histories of Ubin, as well as how it impacts the architecture of the houses found there. Dr. Imran bin Tajudeen researches architectural encounters in maritime Southeast Asia across the Long Dure. He has also received the ICAS Book Prize in 2011 for his doctoral dissertation on this topic. He is co-editor of Southeast Asia's Modern Architecture and has been part of different fellowship programs, such as the MIT Aga Khan program. He has published on topics like Singapore urban history and the cosmopolitan translation of his vernacular architecture. He is Mutawa Visiting Fellow in Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies and is currently Visiting Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore, Department of Malay Studies. Ms. Lee Ka Hui is a graduate student of Cultural Management at the Graduate School of Humanities and Sociology at the University of Tokyo. She conducted her research on the history and settlements of Pulau Ubin in relation to development plans and policies under the tutelage of Dr. Imran. For those on Zoom, if you have any questions during the talk, please send them to co-host Teo Kaming as a private message using the Zoom chat. We will try to address a few of them later on. Before we begin the talk, our speakers would like to have a sense of how familiar our audience are with places in Ubin. Can everyone see the poll? Okay. Do you know the following in Ubin? All right, we are seeing the results coming. Okay, I'll be ending the poll soon. Maybe I'll just give a few more seconds for last few polls to come in. Okay, I'll end the poll now. Thank you for participating in the poll. Without further ado, please join us to welcome our speakers, Dr. Imran and Ka Hui. Dr. Imran and Ka Hui, please.
Thank you for joining us this morning, Ka Hui and myself, for our talk on Pulau Ubin. And I think it's, okay, finally. So this morning, I'll be talking to you about, well, it's going to be about the documentation of 4 houses on Pulau Ubin, but we will also be expanding the discussion to look at the larger picture, which is the social and architectural history of Pulau Ubin in the context of certain policies that have changed over the years, and the current opportunities and challenges that we face, as well as the importance of recovering and actually looking at Pulau Ubin, not just in terms of its natural attributes, but also as a historical settlement site and in connection with its settlements and houses. I want to quickly credit the fact that this project started actually as a module, a level 4000 module that I conducted at the Department of Architecture in the National University of Singapore, and listed here on the cover slide are the names of the students who were involved. So it has expanded considerably since then, but I would still like to acknowledge all the students' work. And these are the houses that were documented, as well as other houses that are going to be referred to. So the 4 houses that were documented are as follows: House 22E, which was how it started. There is a proposal to do something about the house. I can't divulge the full details yet because it is still not officially confirmed, but there's one particular house, and then 3 other houses that we added to the documentation project, so as to understand Pulau Ubin's architecture in its fuller context and not just in isolation. And also to situate these houses within the larger picture of Singapore's Malay Kampung Houses, but which, as I shall explain later, was not an architectural form confined to the Malays. It was a shared architectural form and existed actually all across Singapore, not only in rural areas, but also in urban and suburban areas. So we'll be looking at that a little bit later. But I wanted to start by saying that there is thus far a relative neglect on the history of the Malay communities of Pulau Ubin. And so today what we're going to look at is only a small snippet of the bigger picture of the Malay communities of Pulau Ubin, which we will deliberately be focusing on because it's been relatively neglected, like I said earlier. And even then, we are only looking at a small slice, just the southeastern portion of Pulau Ubin, where the dotted boxes, the broken line boxes, are on the screen. I hope you can see my cursor. So these two, Kampung Sungei Durian and Kampung Surau / Kampung Melayu. So it's really a small study. Now, I also would like to situate the situation about these houses, which are built in wood, in relation to the only conservation building on Pulau Ubin right now, and that is house number 1. And that's a conservation building by URA because it's built in brick. So there's a bias against wood up to this point. It's slowly changing because of Pulau Ubin, and that's significant. Because of Pulau Ubin, the previous bias against wood construction is slowly shifting away. So it's not going to be the case moving forward, hopefully. The other house that has been restored in its original form, so there was no need for rebuilding, was Tek Seng's place. So that's a house museum right now, and that's a Chinese kampong house. So we'll come to that at the very end of the lecture. Right, so just some of the names that I mentioned earlier, and there is in fact an old jetty rather, in addition to the public jetty we are all familiar with when we go to Ubin. So because of the demise of Kampung Surau, which we'll come to later, the jetty here is also no longer there. But going further in terms of the theme I mentioned earlier about focusing on the communities of Malays on Pulau Ubin, I want to share this wonderful map from Rodolphe de Koning's 1994 publication. There is an updated version of the publication. I took this from the 1994 edition. It's bilingual in French and Malay, as you can see in the caption there, top 28 places for Malays. It says, so actually, if you were to look at this map, Pulau Ubin, along with Pulau Tekong, features quite prominently if you focus only on mosques, schools, and cemeteries for the Malay. So it's clustered, as you can remember. So this area we're focusing on, well, that's precisely where these 3 features on Pulau Ubin are found. And furthermore, there are important and interesting links between Pulau Ubin settlement here at Kampung Surau with Pulau Tekong. And what kind of link am I talking about? That's where it becomes interesting. Because of the documentation of one of the houses on Pulau Ubin, we found out, and then I pieced it together with other information, that one of the houses, house 22E on Pulau Ubin, is in fact the house of a descendant of one of the founders the settlement on Pulau Ubin, the Malay settlement at Kampung Surau. And this person, Endut bin Senin, his name is recorded on Jalan Endut Senin, one of the roads on Pulau Ubin, Jalan Endut Senin. You might be familiar with it, but it's not in the area of Kampung Surau. It's further to the west. But Endut bin Senin requested for the permission to found the settlement and to settle Pulau Ubin with some followers from a descendant of Sultan Hussein. So Tengku Abdul Jalil is the son of Sultan Hussein, and then you have other descendants, the elder son in fact, and then there are descendants, so eldest, and then Tengku Ahmad is the one who is well known in the newspaper articles of the 1940s and late 1940s, where he is recorded as the titulary penghulu or headman of a whole host of northeastern islands. So what happened was with the settlement of Pulau Tekong at Kampung Selabin, which is, if we remember this map earlier, is over here, yeah, where the arrow points to on Tekong. That's the connection between the two islands, and that's the so-called capital for the northeastern islands under the jurisdiction of one of the descendants of Sultan Hussein. So what I'm looking at here is a history of Pulau Ubin and the northeastern islands of Singapore beyond the colonial frame. But because of lack of time, I can't elaborate on this. But just to give you a gist of just what kind of history, we can find out by starting with the documentation of one particular house on Pulau Ubin. But beyond that, it's not just a non-colonial or beyond colonial thing. Even if you were to look at colonial survey records, such as these maps from the 1880s for Pulau Ubin, right? You'll be able to find that the Malay owners of houses on Pulau Ubin owned land, and these were recorded in colonial surveys. So these are colonial survey maps, and the names of the Malay landowners, some of them are Javanese, some are Bugis. So when I use the term Malay here, it's an umbrella term, as is often the case in Singapore. Yeah? So we have Javanese here and Bugis and Malay. So you see their names on the record. So it's not just a non-colonial or beyond the colonial story, it's also within the colonial ambit. So it's both. And well, if we were to jump right in to the story of Pulau Ubin today, what we look at today is the aftermath of a long series of uncertainties about the fate of its communities, of its settlements, and of its houses. And so if we look back not too long ago, all sorts of news came up, and this is where I leave off to Kahui to proceed with this story. Kahui, please.
So in 1993, there were plans to develop Pulau Ubin as a resort in the area of Kampung Surau and Kampung Melayu. So in the two maps that we have drawn of the one that we referenced in 1970s and the present map, you can see that in the past, this region here is rather populated, whereas now there's only house number 22E, which is standing at the cross junction on the top left. And so if you look at the map that's before 1993, on the area at the bottom left, there used to be a mangrove-lined creek with boats moored there, according to the residents we interviewed. And also, according to Dr. Imran, where there was old jetty, you can see on the bottom right corner there, which is not present anymore. Okay, next slide, please. The 1987 photos of Kampung Surau and Kampung Melayu from the National Archives gives us a glimpse of how these two kampongs were like before the dense secondary forest took over. Places of significance such as the prayer hall, Surau, and many of the houses no longer exist in the site of former Kampung Surau. House 22E is one of the several houses that is acquired by the state and now has plans for restoration. Next slide, please. In recent years, there has been more attention turned to Pulau Ubin to protect its rustic charm and its natural environment. There has been talks of turning Pulau Ubin into an ecotourism spot and increasing efforts in the restoration of Pulau Ubin's forgotten and neglected traditional kampong houses. 5 vacant kampong houses, including 22E, have first been identified to be restored for community use. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Minister Desmond Lee has also announced the launch of the multi-year Kampong House Restoration Program, where communities of volunteers, architects, designers, and students can come together to restore the dilapidated and abandoned kampong houses. Extending from the initial restoration plans of old unoccupied kampong houses, NParks announced in late 2019 the first major initiative to maintain occupied homes on the island. This addresses problems such as leaking roofs, damaged floorboards, and broken windows faced by 7 kampong houses, including a century-old traditional Malay wooden house, 760D, which we covered in our documentation, and a coffee shop in the town centre. Now I'd like to hand the time back to Dr. Imran, who will talk about the communities in detail.
Thanks, Kawi, and thanks for bravely proceeding despite the fact that the slides lag for your side. But just to explain to the rest, Kawi is joining us from Tokyo, so we don't know whether that's one of the reasons she's experiencing a serious lag in the slides she can see from her side. So to proceed, thanks again, Kawi. So to proceed, we come back to 22E, which is one of the houses that we are looking at in terms of the possibility to. Initially, we were talking about it as a possibility to restore, but now we know it's not possible to restore. So the huge challenge now is that there is a need to rebuild the entire house, partly because the family had to abandon, or the house was acquired, and so they could no longer legally occupy it or maintain it for that matter. And so it was left, as is part of the rules, you're supposed to remove the roof of the house. Yeah, once it's acquired, you cannot leave the roof because that means somebody can still occupy it. And so because of that, it's been exposed to the elements for far too long. And so even though it's actually built of very high quality wood, Sungei wood for in this case, and actually the structural frame of the house is valuable because it has its own history. It was dismantled from another kampong, a rural village in this case, near Changi Airport. It's actually Kampung Darat Nenas. The house was a relative's house. The good wood, the structural frame of the house in Sungei wood was dismantled, and this is the quality of Malay houses, and reassembled here for this house. So actually that makes the house frame quite valuable. It even has a longer history at another village, Kampung Darat Nenas on Singapore at the Changi coast, today beneath the tarmac of the Changi Airport. But unfortunately, as I said, because of damage, it's no longer possible to do anything about the preserving the house. We can't. So we can only rebuild it. Yeah? But if we were to look at the structure of the house, this is what we would like to rebuild to follow the construction system of these houses. Now, unfortunately, again, and this was where we met yet another challenge. Up to the point of this proposal that I made, the BCA, or Building Construction Authority of Singapore, does not have the regulations to calculate and therefore to permit houses like this with wooden carpentry joints. There was no regulation. Whatever wooden buildings we have in Singapore that are under conservation status today, such as this building here. So this is under conservation status. It's on mainland Singapore. It's at Rochor. It's a wayang stage. It's a fascinating example of hybridity. Now, actually, what I mean here is full-on hybridity in the sense that you can see that the roof ornaments are actually in the Hokkien style, but if you were to look at the wall, that's in the Malay construction technique, and the joints as well. It's the same as what you see here at the House 22E on Pulau Ubin, right? And in a case of a conservation building like this in Singapore, there is no way this can be dismantled and rebuilt. It can only be maintained. So if we were to dismantle it and rebuild it, no, we can't in the current conditions. So what we have done is there was a negotiation with the Building Construction Authority of Singapore, and today we have a way to calculate this, and therefore it can now be built from scratch, or for that matter in future rebuilt. So Pulau Ubin now has given us an opportunity to expand the horizon of the conservation of wooden buildings in Singapore, which would otherwise have no means of calculation. This has big implications. There are other buildings that may in future be conserved and may have to be rebuilt, right? Timber parts that have to be replaced and so on. So for example, the well-known and much celebrated wayang stage on Pulau Ubin, right? So you've seen one on the mainland. Now there's another one, almost the same kind of typology. And the other houses, other buildings, sorry, on Pulau Ubin, such as this, yeah, shop house number 40 on Jalan Pekan Ubin. There's the Corner Lab Junction, the same as on House 22E and so on. The coffee shop right next to the jetty, number 9 Jalan Pekan Ubin, owned by the late Haji Ali bin Haji Montel, for example. If you look at the top there, that's the top plate corner tie beams that you can see. Now, it's not just dealing with, so we were talking about technicalities, right? So we've solved it more or less because now BCA is able to accept certain calculation methods with the help of one of the volunteers, an engineer who helped with this. But beyond that, there's also the issue of our image of our Kampong Pa. So I would like to quote Peter Wee here, who wrote in 1989 in a very, I mean, he's talking about how lamentable it is that whenever Kampung Houses, I quote him, come to mind, the picture conjured up is invariably of dilapidated houses, broken down wooden walls with missing planks, patchy leaking atap roofs, etc., decaying vegetation, dirty or muddy land. This may be true, he says, of some kampungs, but was not at all true of our kampung, he said. He lived at the multi-ethnic Malay village of Kampong Amber near Katong, and in Katong. In the kampung where we lived, the ground was clean, well swept, free from leaves. Families maintained their houses. No planks were missing in any wall. Housewives, especially the Malays, were house proud and saw to it that every part of the house was spick and span. So we're talking here about a certain way we have a negative stereotypical image of kampung houses. And I hope that we can go beyond that. You know, in many occasions, in many instances, the reasons for this are structural rather than a willful neglect. For whatever reason, too much to elaborate here, but I would like us to also address this head-on, this issue of our stereotypes about kampung houses, and to look at these houses. Of course, some of us might protest, you know, this kind of orthographic, technical redrawing of the kampung houses is guilty of another way of seeing it that does not really pay attention to lived or ground reality. So you can say this is a complicity in subjecting the vernacular architecture to a kind of architectural drawing gaze, you know, modes of representation. Nevertheless, there are various forms of I could say modes of representation that contest with each other to claim our attention when we think about kampung houses, right? So there's also the technical and the architectural aspect. How do we build? You only see this kind of wall construction, rather, the one I'm illustrating here, which is the jenang, the stud and rail, jenang tegak, jenang lintang, and then the baroti method to do the weatherboarding. We only see this now, sadly, in places like Old Town Coffee Shop. You know, they build it as the internal wall, as a kind of decoration. How sad, you know, that it's actually. And if you remember, this is the form of the wall construction used on the two Chinese opera stages, the wayang stages that we saw earlier. So this is the kind of jenang and baroti, or stud and rail. The kinds of houses, also we need to think about the typological diversity and variety in the Malay house form. There's no time for me to elaborate, so I'm just going to show you some visuals. The traditional form of the Malay type house, and then the modern form, the Limas house form, which can be built entirely in brick, for example, or in wood. These are all examples that used to be found in Singapore. The other challenge that we face on Pulau today is the ground reality of the emptying out of Pulau Ubin's communities and the kinds of knowledge the communities would have held. You know, the kinds of things that you would find out only through interviews, such as these notes that I wrote during my interview with Pak Ahmad back in April 2013. You know, and also looking at the study of place histories through various dimensions that access people's memory. So it's about looking at how people remembered them, and how the settlements were connected to each other, and so on. So that kind of anthropological and sociological dimension of study beyond just looking at the physical material of the house. Even if we were to focus on houses, the houses hold memory. So for example, look at that. I mean, I found it so poignant, you know, the way Pak Ahmad, that's how it's spelled, the AHA, but it's pronounced Ahmad. He has this photograph of the house these two photographs of the house he had, his old house, after his marriage to his late wife. Cik Sapia is here in the photograph on the left. And he pasted it down on a book on Pulau Ubin using these skin plaster, because he didn't have tape. But what's important was he was saying this publication on Pulau Ubin did not have a photo of his house, so he pasted it there. I thought that was that's such a good anecdote to talk about what I mean. You know, the fact that we're talking out here about place histories, people's histories. You know, and if a house like that is missing, what does that say about our maybe not a full understanding? But coming back to a technical understanding of houses, my interview with Pak Ahmad, for example, brought up a lot of gaps in what we know. So there are certain terms that are specific to Pulau Ubin, which you don't find in the standard texts on Malay houses. Well, here's a quick visual survey of the different houses found on Pulau Ubin. So You've got the simpler form with the straightforward gable roof, such as this. An illustration of a house that formerly stood there. They're actually quite different, and one of them, at least one of them seems a little bit more in conformity with what we understand of Bugis houses, but again, no time to elaborate on that. The one in the illustration. And there are, in fact, Bugis communities on Pulau Ubin. This one is Lima's house, the well-known house of Madame Camaria, where classes for cooking using the herbs found in the garden around the house are used, for example. And this house is also a house with a history. I mean, it's one of the rare examples where you have a dated column. So the column on one of the columns of the houses has the date 1931. That's the date of rebuilding, not the date of the original construction, but date of rebuilding. So it's quite impressive and nice that we have a date for one of the houses at least. This is also the typological way to read the house. And other examples such as this, another example of the Rumah Limas, still very well maintained. These are houses in Kampung Sungei Durian, right? In contrast to Kampung Surau, which has been completely abandoned because the land was acquired. And these houses, we also can see them within the larger context of discussions, academic discussion, no doubt, about the position of these houses in the history of architecture in Southeast Asia. I would like to end on this last note of comparing across Singapore. So you've got these houses on Bedok, for example, but also that these houses were found in the Orchard Road area by different clients, the raised floor version, right, where the kolong or the space downstairs is built up in bricks. But if you remove that, it comes back to this kind of a Rumah Limas form. You've got houses in suburban areas such as Geylang Serai and so on. So actually Pulau Ubin has to be positioned within this larger spectrum, and it's precious because it's the only one left. Now coming to the last section of the talk, the Chinese Kampung Houses, I mentioned that I would end with this. Now, if you look at the Chinese Kampung Houses, it's already a known fact. Maybe some of us forget. It was already published by the Oral Archives in 1993 in a publication called Kampong Days. So it has a very specific layout. The core house would tend to look like this, right? A centralized door with two flanking windows. That's a core house. And the core house might be added onto either at the back like that in the kitchen or the side. Later we will see one with the side added as a kitchen. But much more important is that the locations for the altars, where the ancestral Taoist or Buddhist, right? And that's what really distinguishes it from a Malay house. But the plan otherwise is that of a Malay type house plan. So the plan is a Malay type house plan with these modifications for the placement of altars. So here we're talking about yet another way to talk about the Malay house type as a shared form that was also built for Chinese residences and with very specific architectural spaces for Chinese type altars. Yeah, and sometimes the architect for a Chinese client, such as the house here, could be a Malay. The architect is H.D. Ali, for a client Lee Kim at Zion Road. How fantastic is that? We've forgotten these things. Now, if you come back to Pulau Ubin, that's Tek Seng's house. Tek Seng's house, I just wanted to add an interesting note. This is the core house here with the door in the center. And actually, this is a separate building, right? It's fused together. So it's actually like this. The kitchen here. So this is an example of the same type. It would have originally had a different roof. At some point, when the family decided to rebuild from atap to zinc, this must have been fused together under one huge roof. So that's a very interesting, when I saw this, it's interesting that that development has occurred. So here's what a house like Tek Seng's place would look like without the kitchen and then with the kitchen. Yeah. And his is with the kitchen fused together, as I mentioned. Okay, so I want to end with a last anecdote. This is the case of one of the houses in the poll just now. The house where the durian tree used to stand. Some of you might be familiar. It's opposite. I think, sorry, this is not in the poll, but if you were going to the drink stall will be to the right in this photograph. We are looking from the cycling track, the road. And if you look down the slope, you would have seen this house in the past. Some of you might have gone there early enough in the past to have seen this original form. Now, the durian tree fell. That in itself is a tragic case of, because actually people in Pulau Ubin knew it was going to fall. Pa Ahmad from the drink stall knew because he could tell when something is about to fall. But there were regulations at that time forbidding anybody from doing anything like that, like chopping down a tree. You're not allowed because of new regulations. And because of that, they couldn't do anything, and the tree fell onto the house. Now, but fortunately now, after the house, we're quite lucky the entire house didn't collapse. They just had to extend the roof and then rebuild parts of the walls that had collapsed like that. So actually, for us, when we look at this is an example of community capacity. the residents of Pulau Ubin, as late as the 2013 to 2015 to 2016 period, are able to come together on their own, on their own, and rebuild a house like that. So now after rebuilding. So I want to end on this note that there's a lot of potential on Pulau Ubin, and we need to be really careful in how we manage this. It's the last kampung landscape. We shouldn't just talk about it as a natural landscape. It's the last kampung landscape in Singapore. We need to pay more attention to the Malay cultural, architectural, and community heritage. We need to think about the roles that different houses in the area play even today for Pulau Ubin's socio-cultural activities, immersion activities. They play a lot of roles, but what do they get in return? They function almost like community centers, community clubs, but the houses are falling apart. They need some kind of restoration, and now we have the program from NParks to do this, and that's really, really wonderful. And I think we really need to look forward to more such initiatives, so that this is the first opportunity we have to finally, kind of turn back and say, hey, what have we been doing in terms of how we deal with the vernacular built environment, wooden houses in Singapore that since at least 1969 and 1970s have all become outlawed. I don't know whether you are this, but if you had a wooden house on mainland Singapore, no, you're not allowed to. So this is the first time that we are starting to look at wooden houses in this way. And I think it's really, really important that we put on our thinking hats and look at the whole situation in a broadened horizon. And Pulau Ubin stands at the core of this new enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Imran and Kahui, for such an interesting talk. Now we have come to the Q&A session. Thank you to those who have submitted questions. Okay. For our first question, are there any ways in which volunteers can get involved in upcoming projects? And what is the hope for your hope, Dr. Imran, for the future of Pulau Ubin? And what would you like the public to know and appreciate?
Do I answer it now, or do the second? Okay. Yeah, thank you for this question. Definitely, there is a very big role that volunteers can play. And it's not just about restoring the houses, but also proper documentation. So that is a big challenge. We don't really have a proper documentation of Pulau Ubin as a cultural landscape. So that in itself, if NParks were to initiate something like that, it would definitely need volunteers. It's not an easy task, because you also are entering people's homes, you're entering their compounds, and so it has to be done sensitively, and also with the buy-in and the support of the residents must feel they have a stake in it as well. So we're talking here about a holistic approach to a landscape, and that involves the people who live there as part of the the players involved. So the volunteers would come in terms of the interfacing and in the documentation. I think that's really important. Kawi, do you want to add anything? Because you were, in a way, almost like a volunteer when you were documenting the houses, Kind of saying it tongue in cheek. We need to unmute.
Oops, sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Okay. Any ways volunteers can get involved in the upcoming projects? I would say maybe we can do off with a starting point of like getting more interested in Ubin, because a lot of Ubin activities and projects, they do not really get out to the public. There's not much awareness of what's going on in Ubin. So I think the very baseline is to actually share what you know about Ubin, about the kampong landscape in Ubin, about how there's still houses and people living in Ubin. I think that's the starting line we can all help with. Yes. Is that okay?
Okay, I see. So we'll move on to the second question then. I hope the answers have been satisfactory to the person asking. So the next question, what was your most memorable episode during the documentation process for both of you?
Dr. Shall I go first? Okay, I'll go first then since I'm unmuted. Okay. I would say rather than most memorable, something that left me with a very strong impression was when Abang Asman is one of the residents of Ubin who has been helping us with our project by driving with us around, introducing us to different parts of Ubin that we never knew. So he actually drove us to the former site of Kampong Surau. And he used to live around the area, but his house was actually removed during the acquisition of the land. So he was like really just standing there pointing to us. The Surau used to be here, the school used to be here, in a very, how do I put into words? His tone was, there was this tinge of sadness and this tinge of like he can't do anything about it. So this is what he has decided to live with. Yeah, it really left me a very strong impression, like how things can change really fast within a few years, and how the place where he once called home could just, be dilapidated and like be gone after a few years. Yeah, that was the one episode that was very strong with me. Yeah, how about Dr. Imran?
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Kawi. Indeed, there was, for me as well, memorable, memorable sounds very celebratory, but it was very sad.
Yeah, but it's,
And so Abang Azman still lives, I'm not sure if he is on Pulau Ubin now because of COVID, but he operates his business there and he lives there. So it's quite painful for him to have to live on Pulau Ubin in another person's home when he used to have his own, So for him, he's very happy to see all the plans to restore, or in some cases rebuild some houses, but he is, you can imagine, doubly sad that his house missed that boat, and because he's living there, he lives there, so his house would have been so great to have been there still today, but it's gone. So to us that was, and he was talking about his settlement, Kampung Surau, the one that Kawi shared earlier, is completely gone today. As the photos show, it's just all you see are trees. That's where the fiction of Pulau Ubin as this natural haven. It is a natural haven, but sometimes it's something that took over what were settlements. And I would like to add, actually, the other memorable episode for us was how residents were themselves caretakers of the environment. So they took care. So it's not like a either or in opposition to each other. Cultural and natural in this case is a continuum. The people who live in these houses, they took care of what was around them. Like they knew how to take care of the trees. They could identify the trees. They knew how to take care of the land and so on. So yeah, and they knew which species was where, how to take care of the trees and so on. So yeah, it for us, it was memorable to see this, as well as the kind of close relationship to what was around them. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for answering. We have time for perhaps one more question. Yes. Let me push. What difficulties did you all face in the documentation of the houses?
Should I start this one too?
Yes.
Okay, let's say rather than difficulties, there was this like interesting aspect to it as well, that every time we go down to like measure the houses and to interview the residents, there's always new information that's coming in. New information that is overwriting what we actually knew or we thought we knew. And so there was this never-ending process of like adding on information, and at tiring times where we were working until like 3 a.m. It's like, is this ever ending? That's me and other students. Sometimes we think about it. But yeah, I think that is all of the challenges that we face, but it's a good challenge because that means that the information we're getting is, is more thorough than what we actually had. Yeah, Dr. Imran, do you want to add anything?
Well, that's exactly what I was saying earlier about the fact that, I give just one example, how Pak Ahmad's information on the names really adds on to, but it's more than that, yeah, indeed. And also, I think we also face sometimes, there's also always the flip side to things. Some residents are not so only one actually, in our case, we documented 4. One of the residents was not so forthcoming. The person was not welcoming of the documentation request. So I think it may have to do with a lot of factors beyond us. That means it's not about us per se. So it's not, nothing revolves around us in that sense. The sentiment of maybe pain or anger or unhappiness have larger reasons. So that's what I was also intimating towards. Out of 4, only 1. Yeah, so 3 residents were very welcoming, and they were why has it taken so long for this to happen for them? Yeah, but for at least one, the sense of no, don't bother me, and I don't know why you want to document. What is it for? Why do you want to do this? So sometimes there's also this notion of maybe it's got to do also with the kinds of experiences that the residents have had to go through across the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. So I think, we might be, today we're very lucky to have this thing called Pesta Ubin, but we are at the tip of a big iceberg. So a lot of other things have happened before your time, before our time. So I think there's also this kind of, that's also memorable for us. That was also memorable for us during the documentation process. And as more volunteers come into the picture, they might also experience something similar, yeah, as they talk to residents.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Dr. Imran and Kahui, for answering our questions. Wow, I will not see the Kampong Houses the same way again. And it's really tough work that you all are doing, like going through all the process of like documentation and scanning through the history. Okay, I hope all the audience here have also learned something interesting as well. Let me continue. Oh. Okay. Okay, back to this. If you are interested to find out more about some of the Kampong houses which have undergone restoration, please check out the Ubin Day 2020 playlist on our MParks SG YouTube channel for the newly released virtual tours on Kampong houses. And if that's not enough for some of you history buffs out there, do check out another virtual tour by MParks. And this tour takes you to the military installation at the National Police Cadet Corps Camp Resilience. And you would be able to find out more about the military history of that place. Up next on our Ubin Day webinar, we will be joined by Associate Professor Dan Fries from the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore. He will be sharing with us on mangrove restoration. Mangrove restoration is not just about planting plants in the mangrove. Many countries have done that and still fail. What's the secret to success? Do stay tuned if you want to find out more about mangrove restoration. And if you're free right after this, you may also join our NBC colleagues, National Biodiversity Centre, at their MParks Spotlight Talk at 10:30 a.m., Capturing Wild Moments. Speaker Mr. Bernard Seah would share with all of us about ethical practices for photographing our wildlife. This will be found in our MParks SG channel. This brings us to the end of this session. Thank you, Dr. Imran and Kahui, once again for sharing with us. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. We hope you have enjoyed the session. Okay, for YouTube audience, we will say goodbye to you first. Do share your feedback with us by accessing the URL in the description below. For Zoom audience, please stay on for a short while for us to take a group photo together. And back to YouTube audience, hope to see you again later. Bye-bye.